good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are, or whenever you're watching this live stream. My name is Anthony Pratchard. Second, I'm going to be your host for this exciting book panel. Along with my co-chair, Daniela Sheenan, I would like to welcome you to the first public offering from the Urban History Association's Early Career Committee. This is a brand new development within the UHA to better serve emerging scholars and young professionals interested in urban history. Our vision is to provide programming, mentorship, and support for this segment of our community coming out of our global pandemic. So this specific event is part of the association's Urban History Month project. If you're not a member of the UHA, we hope that you'll consider joining us today, as this is the best way to support our efforts to encourage the historical study and teaching of cities, suburbs, and metropolitan regions in all time periods throughout the world. We'll post a link to our membership page in the chat so those with interest may follow up. But today we're blessed to be in the presence of three outstanding emergent urban historians. Our three panelists have all published their first peer-reviewed monograph in the past year and a half, which means they all published their first book during the middle of a global quarantine. So today is an opportunity for us to salute their efforts, their industry, their persistence, their tenacity, and above all, their contributions to our broader understanding of urban history. It's no small task to write a book, as many of us know, but this is even more with the first book. Mentorship, guidance, quite often research fellowships help lay a path for early career scholars to pass their first peer review. Moreover, though, the first book can be seen as a business card in a sort of way, signifying to the broader world, here's who I am as a scholar, and here's my vision of how we can understand our history. For those who have published their first book during the pandemic, the typical conference circuits, book signings, invited lectures, and other promotional materials have not been available. So today is an opportunity for our colleagues to share their journey with those most interested in the future of our field, the graduate students, the postdocs, the junior fellows, the program directors, the policy analysts, and all the early career scholars seeking to make their own imprint on urban history. So, without further ado, give me an opportunity to introduce our scholars. We'll start with Destin Jenkins, who's a scholar of racial inequality. His work bridges the fields of economic, urban, and political history and focuses on capitalism, democracy, and social movements in the United States during the long 20th century. He's the author of The Bonds of Inequality, Debt, and the Making of the American City, published by the University of Chicago Press this year. This book resituates the history of urban development in post-war San Francisco and the financing networks that underwrote the construction of the built environment. His major argument is that racial inequalities in the city by the Bay were critically tied to these financial arrangements, and that these, as much or even more so than local political dynamics, were central in determining the distribution of resources within the city. Jenkins is also the principal investigator and curator of The Business of Debt, a digital humanities project that reveals how the 20th century municipal bond market was not driven by abstract processes, but stitched together through a small but powerful cadre of financiers and attorneys. He is co-editor of The Histories of Racial Capitalism, also published by Columbia University Press in 2021, which brings together scholars across a range of disciplines to revisit the persistent question of the relationship between race and capitalism. His writings have appeared in the Washington Post, The Nation, and the New York Times, and he has served as the Capitalism Series editor at Public Books and is co-editor of Just Money. Jenkins earned his undergraduate degree from Columbia University and his PhD from Stanford. Before joining the faculty at Stanford, he was a Neubauer Family Assistant Professor of History at the University of Chicago. And he has held fellowships at the Charles Warren Center for the Studies of American History at Harvard University and the Robert L. Hillbronner Center for the Study of Capitalism at the New School. Next, in fact, real quick though, because today's salute, just clap to Destin for what he's been able to do so far. Thank you for joining us, man. We really appreciate this. All right, so next there's Rebecca Marchiel, a historian of urban history, political history, and the history of American capitalism. She is the author of After Redlining, the Urban Reinvestment Movement in the Era of Financial Deregulation, published by also the University of Chicago in 2020. This book examines how the US financial system shaped and was shaped by the political organization and the political organizing of ordinary people during the last third of the 20th century. It charts the story of a multiracial coalition of low and moderate income urbanites who sought community control over investment capital. Focusing on Chicago's West Side, after redlining illuminates how urban activists were able to change banks' behavior to support investment in communities that they had once abandoned. Drawing on the unprocessed archive of the movement's lead organization, National People's Action, the project explores how activists fought to preserve the benefits of regulated banking at a time when the New Deal financial regime began to crumble. This multiracial coalition of low and moderate income city residents, inspired by Saul Alinsky, championed urban reinvestment that culminated in federal legislation, specifically the Home Mortgage Disclosure Act and the Community Reinvestment Act. After redlining provides a blueprint of hope in the ongoing battle for urban equity. Marchiel received her BA from the University of Michigan and her PhD from Northwestern University. She taught history at Franklin and Marshall College for 1 year before joining the faculty at the University of Mississippi in 2015 and was awarded a fellowship from Harvard's Charles Warren Center in 2015-2016. Rebecca, thank you so much for joining us, and congratulations again. Congratulations. Finally, we'll be joined by Gabriel Winant. He is a historian of the social structures of inequality in modern American capitalism. His work approaches capitalism as an expansive social order, not confined to the market alone, but rather structurally composed of multiple heterogeneous spheres. He focuses on the relationship between economic production and formal employment on the one hand, and the social reproduction and governance of the population on the other. Broadly, he is interested in the transformations of the social division of labor and in the making and management of social difference through this process. His first book, The Next Shift, The Fall of Manufacturing and the Rise of Healthcare in Rust Belt America, published by, I believe it's Harvard University Press, but it investigates the rise of the service economy in the aftermath of manufacturing. The Next Shift locates the origins of today's social inequality in America's post-war political economy. Across the Rust Belt, the healthcare industry today dominates employment, accounting for 1 in 5 jobs in places like Detroit, Rochester, Baltimore, and Pittsburgh. As the care economy has grown, it's become an engine of insecurity for workers who are overwhelmingly women and people of color, employed at low wages and in precarious positions. Using Pittsburgh as a case study, The Next Shift shows how deindustrialization triggered the ascent of the care economy and stamped it with the inequalities produced by the New Deal states' hierarchies of race and gender. Before coming to the University of Chicago, Winant was a visiting scholar at the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. He also writes frequently for publications such as The Nation, Dissent, and N+1. Gabe, congratulations. Thank you again for joining us. We're so happy to have you with us here today. And so this panel has been named Cities Under Fire. Cities Under Fire. The idea behind this panel, and really the idea behind these books, is looking at the way that finance, in insurance, and real estate have, I would describe it as being involved in slash and burn investment. If you know, slash and burn, it's this idea, it comes from agriculture actually. But the idea is you can see the way that the fire segment of the economy in the post-war period through these 3 texts have really, in some ways, undermined the development of American cities, but so that they could be reborn again in a new way. This is the thing that we've seen throughout this pandemic as it's laid bare the precarity of our broader healthcare infrastructure. So the research that these scholars have done on legal concepts such as municipal bonds, mortgage debt, or labor negotiations, it shows how these processes empowered financial investors to intervene in urban infrastructure development. So today, what we're going to have an opportunity to do is talk with these scholars first about their research, what it means to the field, what it means to our broader society in understanding exactly how American cities have developed in the post-war period. But we'll also get a chance to talk about their own journey, their writing process, how it is that they came to this research, which drove their interest in the topic, what was necessary for them to complete these projects, and what impact they hope to have on the broader study of urban history. We'll also get a chance to learn more just about the nuts and bolts of publishing. How do you put a book proposal together? What are some factors to consider in deciding what press to publish with? What are some things that they wish they knew before they started this journey? So we'll begin by giving each of our scholars a little bit of time to discuss each of their projects before coming together in a group discussion to really get into the writing process, what it means, and the broader direction that we see this type of scholarship leading our field. Finally, we'll open up with questions from the audience and just have a broader conversation where we can be social, get a chance to know each other, and learn more about really what the early career committee can do to serve early career scholars such as these authors, and also people who might be in the audience. So we will go in alphabetical order just for the sanctity of my sanity. And we'll start by giving Dr. Jenkins a little bit of time to talk about the origins of his book project, what drove his interest in the topic, and also if there's just any things that he wants to talk about as we sit here to celebrate the success that he's had in publishing his first book. So without further ado, I'll turn the floor over to you, Destin.
Thank you, Anthony. Thank you to everyone on this Saturday morning, afternoon, again, wherever you're at. Really appreciate you being here. Thank you to you, Anthony, for bringing us together. Really appreciate it. Your efforts in kind of formulating the abstract and kind of bringing us together in this way, and for obviously your role on the committee. It's a really important intervention. And we're really grateful to you and the rest of the committee for kind of creating space for this kind of conversation. And of course, shout out to the Urban Historical Association, which just, this is my first home, and really grateful for the kind of programming you've been able to put on. So let me, I guess, just because that was it's such a heavy question about, kind of the writing process, how I came to the work. Let me just kind of, just in case folks haven't read the book, kind of give an overview of what the book is about, and the kind of the first question that I kind of proceeded from. And the first is, it proceeds from a very simple but often ignored question of how it is and why it is that American cities came to rely on the private bond market for its most critical infrastructure and social services, water, schools, playgrounds, you name it. And so really kind of thinking about a structural dependence and how that came to be. And it proceeds from a second related question, which is, within this arrangement, who or what, which projects, which communities, which neighborhoods were rendered worthy of debt, unworthy of debt. And so those are the kind of two questions that I think kind of motivate the story that I tell, or animate the story that I tell over 9 chapters or so. As to the first question, the book argues that the kind of structural dependence that, again, we kind of take for granted was really born out of New Deal banking reform, the Banking Act of 1933 in particular, which is not to say that cities hadn't relied on the bond market before that, but during capitalism's greatest crisis, as it's often been described, this so-called public-private partnership between cities and bond rating agencies and commercial banks and investment banks, bond attorneys and others was rekindled. And so that's the kind of legislative basis, I suppose, for the kind of structural dependence that really develops over the post-war years. And that dependence is reinforced as well by what we might describe as kind of bankers' ideology, the kind of allegories they told about the dangers of federal encroachment and the importance of the market, reinforced as well by the kind of cult of expertise, the sense that only municipal appointees, controllers, and other technocrats could manage the purse. And the kind of bond finance must be sort of insulated from democratic input. And so in that sense, the kind of dependence gets reinforced through a cult of expertise. Only the experts should have a say in it, which greatly favors the bond financiers in the story that I tell. And I think it also is that dependence is reinforced by a kind of Cold War context. I don't make this explicit in the book, but the general sense that, like, in the United States, the idea of federal ownership or operation of municipal facilities is seen as anathema, right? Is at odds with the political culture in the United States. Is something that bankers traffic and help to sell cities on to again, kind of protect their unique position as the financier of infrastructure and services in cities. So that's the kind of the structural, legislative, and kind of cultural, social basis for dependence. And that's to the second question of who or what was rendered worthy of debt. I kind of developed that through the idea of an infrastructural investment in whiteness. We're thinking about consumption, the importance of consumption to growth at mid-century, in the sense that if you can build the infrastructure, playgrounds and parks and stadiums for white middle class, you might be able to convince them to stay in the city. And even those who live in the suburbs, you might entice them to come back to the city to secure local forms of growth. And you can actually secure, and it's a kind of what I call an intra-racial cross-class compact, whereby white workers in segregated building trades literally build the infrastructure on which a white middle class depends, all while kicking back tax-exempt interest income to wealthy bondholders, many of whom are institutional investors and wealthy white folks. So there's the kind of infrastructural investment in whiteness that powered the sense of who or what was rendered worthy of debt, who or what was rendered unworthy of debt. So that's the kind of the two questions, the argument I kind of develop over the course again of the 9 chapters. So that's just for folks who haven't read the book, what the book is trying to do, the questions it's trying to take up. I came to this work. I mean, I can give some milestones. The financial crisis, I think, for all 4 of us, really meant something personally, just in terms of seeing family members unemployed or having family members undergo foreclosure, et cetera. So that to me got me interested in political economy. Detroit's bankruptcy in 2013 was another big milestone. You start to hear questions around creditors and who takes a haircut and all the stuff around really the kind of sale of public assets. And for me, thinking about what that meant for a Black city really got me interested in race and debt. But I think now that I look back on the project, I really do think it's an attempt to kind of understand my childhood and navigating inequality in 1990s New York City. So I came of age kind of in that kind of Giuliani era, New York City. Jenkins is out, Giuliani, we used to call him, is in power. And so trying to think about inequality. I lived in Queens, New York, but also went to a private school in Manhattan. And so it was kind of that really dissonance, I suppose you could say, that kind of framed my childhood. So that's when I became aware of overlapping forms of inequality. So wealth. At home, I was the richest kid on the block, with the sneakers and the Jordans and the sports equipment. But at school, my private school, I was the poorest kid. Went to school with kids with multiple homes and in the Hamptons and so forth. So becoming aware of the difference between income and wealth, and also thinking spatially at home, the kind of quality of local courts and public infrastructure wasn't the greatest. But when I went to my private school, Central Park literally was the park we played in. I mean, it was so thinking about the kind of access we had just by virtue of being students at this private school, and the sort of racial dynamics. I was only one of a few to have access to this, one of the few Black kids at the school. And so I kind of look back to think about if the book is about the overlapping forms of inequality, wealth, spatial, and racial. I think in many ways, now that I look back on it, the book is an attempt to try to think about how that came to be, how my experience came to be, and how my parents then kind of had to navigate those different dynamics. And I pursued that through municipal debt much later. That is to say, I decided municipal debt could be my vantage point into thinking about the overlapping forms of inequality at a much later date. But now that I look back at it again, it's trying to make sense of 1990s New York City from my vantage point as a little kid taking the subways between Queens and the Upper East Side.
Thank you, Destin. That's very rich. That's very rich. Who is worthy of investment? What is the difference between income and wealth? I think that's something we all really need to think about. What does it mean to make money versus what does it mean to have money? And then finally, that idea of coming to understand our experiences, that's certainly been integral to my work. And I'm interested in seeing how it's working with Becky and Gabe as well. So next up, we're going to have Becky. She's going to give us an opportunity to just share her journey, talk about some of the things that influenced her on her path, some of the questions that she was trying to answer as she began this research, and really thinking about, what type of impact her book's going to have on the broader study of urban history. So without further ado, thank you.
Well, thank you, Anthony, so much for the invitation and bringing us together. And thank you to the Early Career Committee and the UHA. And I'm so excited to be in conversation with Gabe and Destin, right? Two books that came out that are just like so scribbled, right? My copy is over here. It's just like so many mind explosions all over those two texts. So I'm honored to be included in this crew. And I really love Destin's invitation to think about the sort of autobiographical components of our research projects, because I have often wondered how much of my parents' own history as white flighters out of Detroit in the 70s has sort of informed my own interest in questions about the neighborhood and the old neighborhood, right? And looking, I potentially was drawn to this project in part because in the story I tell, the urban reinvestment movement, instead of making the choice that my parents made, which was to move to an all-white suburb when their all-white neighborhood stopped being all-white in the early 1970s, right? And the story of the reinvestment movement is folks of that same generation who chose a different trajectory and had a different vision and saw different possibilities. And I think I became a little obsessed with that in part because it was a choice my parents didn't make. But I actually found the project not because I had some really brilliant research question ahead of time. It was 2008. I was out for a jog. I was listening to the Planet Money podcast. Financial system collapsing all over. Everyone's freaking out about mortgage-backed securities, some subprime lending. And I heard a bank lobbyist on Planet Money talk about how the Community Reinvestment Act was responsible for like bringing down the global economy. And I knew that wasn't true. I knew that much, right? So for context, the Community Reinvestment Act, right, is this legislation from 1977. It said that banks had to make some effort to lend in low and moderate income communities like outside their offices. And I knew about that legislation because when I worked in nonprofits in 2005, 2007, I worked in fundraising. And so when we had something like an asset-based development program that was supposed to be an anti-poverty strategy, or children's savings accounts that was also pitched as an anti-poverty strategy. We could get banks to lend us money because of the community, or to donate money, because the Community Reinvestment Act said they had to do something. And by 2005, like that's what they were doing, right? They'd give nonprofits a check and say, start some children's savings accounts. This is gonna help everybody find their bootstraps. So I was like, this law, right, does not have the capacity to bring down the global economy. So after listening to that podcast, I came back home to see if any historian had sort of written the origin story of the CRA. Super excited to find out that while, social scientists, right, urbanists that had looked at this legislation, there hadn't really been the historical work that I was envisioning. And so came to find out that the organization that was sort of behind the Community Reinvestment Act in the 1970s, this group called National People's Action, it was still going. By that point, it was called People's Action, and they had a basement full of unprocessed archives, right? Unprocessed papers, like 10, 12 file cabinets of just like mess. And they were like, you can look at whatever you want, right? So I didn't really have a research question right away, besides like, what's the deal with the Community Reinvestment Act? But then the sources, right, really helped me think about what those sources told me about, right, this moment in the 1970s. And I sort of developed research questions from the sources, right? And those questions came to be, what was the relationship between community organizing and the financial system, right? How do we make sense of something like the Community Reinvestment Act and the shifting landscape of federal urban policy and a move towards austerity, right? So the questions really arose in conversation with the sources. I would say like the book, to sort of give an overview, Anthony already did a really good job doing that, but right, I do see it as a history of a social movement, right? It looks at the urban reinvestment movement, this group of low and moderate income urbanites who were all trying to sort of rally around this idea of urban reinvestment that they defined really capaciously, right? They thought that previously redline neighborhoods needed more than just more bank loans. They needed more federal funding. They needed more targeted programs, like even things like reduced prescription costs for urban seniors, right, were part of their robust vision for what it would mean to actually reinvest in American cities. But I ultimately look at how what they really win over the course of the 70s and the 80s is this legislation like the Community Reinvestment Act that gives them access to rights to more lending, but not necessarily this more sort of robust vision. And so I'm happy to talk more about, the nitty gritty of other parts of the narrative there. But I was really excited to find a social movement was behind the Community Reinvestment Act, because I didn't know it was there when I was running, right? I just really sort of lucked out in that regard. But in terms of this question about, I know Anthony, you asked us to think about how we got things done or who we'd like to thank. One of the things that sort of came to mind in this moment of celebration is just how grateful I feel to be an urban historian at this particular moment, because the field does feel like one that is very sort of supportive and collaborative, rather than, I don't know, I had all these ideas about academia as being this really like competitive, cutthroat place where it's like, I don't let anybody see my sources and like, I got to get this thing out first. But I've been really excited to see how much sort of sharing and, collaboration and support has come out of the crew of urban historians, and including folks who are in this call right now, like my friend Ben Holtzman I see here, and Monica Campbell. But yeah, just want to celebrate how this field has been a lot more collaborative and supportive than my wildest dreams. So I'll just stop there. I have lots to say later.
Thank you so much, Becky. I think that's one of the highlights of the Urban History Association. I know I've been involved at this point for almost a decade. My first one was back at Columbia University in 2012. And that's one of the reasons I keep coming back, because it's good people, it's great scholarship, but it certainly does feel like a community. And I even think that little bit of game you gave us, that idea of developing your research questions from your sources. So not going into the archives with preconceived notions in that way, or going into the archives looking for, the evidence to piece together your argument, but letting the archive speak to you and let the archive tell the story. And you're just merely a conduit through it. I think that's very, very valuable for all of us who are coming up. Thank you for sharing that. So next we're gonna have Gabe. I lived in Pittsburgh for a little bit. I had a fellowship at Carnegie Mellon University. So I was really excited when I got a chance to read another Pittsburgh history book. I thought it was fantastic. I really like The Next Shift. So I'm looking forward to hearing your words and your comments, Gabe.
Well, thanks, Anthony, for organizing and getting this panel together. It's really nice to be here and, to join these two colleagues whose work I admire so much and have learned so much from. And I see friendly faces and names on the participants list as well. So I feel that UHA embrace that everyone is talking about. So I guess I'll follow Becky and Destin's examples here and do a little kind of auto bio and a little summary of the book together, maybe. I, like Destin and like Becky, the 2008 crisis is an important part of the story of the development of my work too. And in particular, I responded to the reemergence of a kind of like public discourse about social and economic inequality after, some period of years where that was not a central question on the agenda, by wanting to ask kind of classic Marxist questions about class formation and, where is the working class in the present, and how can we understand the seeming absence or relative weakness of resistance from below to both the origins and consequences of the 2008 crisis. That is to say, although we're in a period where we're again talking about and seeing very visibly and painfully the renaissance of social and economic inequality, the classic kind of correspondent and counterweight to that seemed not to exist anymore, right? And that was certainly how people talked about it. And even I would say within the historical profession, right? We talked about inequality without having some sense of, in the present, of questions of social class as having real purchase on our contemporary reality. And it really struck me that quite, painfully, that class was something that still seemed to be in the past, right? When the factory closed and, the auto worker and the steel worker and the coal miner were laid off, that the story of the American working class ended. And whatever inequality then persisted and intensified after that point was a different story in some fundamental way. And yeah, I grew up in Philadelphia. I did my PhD at Yale, so I was starting to think hard about these questions in New Haven. And these are cities, both where I grew up and where I was in grad school, where there was a very kind of vaunted kind of story about an eds and meds recovery, right? That yes, these were once kind of hard hit manufacturing towns that went through the urban crisis in the 60s and 70s, but now, thanks to their anchor institutions, which link them to sources of investment, which link them to labor markets, kind of high-end labor markets, and educated and skilled professional labor. They've gone through these recoveries. They've been able to reattract, white populations to move back, et cetera. Looking around, especially New Haven, because when I was a little older, but it's true in any place like this, you can see some version of that story has some elements of truth in it, but also there are very obviously thousands and thousands and thousands of people who are here who are not part of that story as it's told, right? But are part of the institutions that story is about. In other words, an institution like Yale University and Yale New Haven Hospital, overwhelmingly the largest employer in not just in New Haven, but in the region. Right? It's not only attracting graduate students like myself, not only is it, seeding biotech firms and pharma firms that are attracting young people with, young white people who want to move into, repurposed lofts and do that story, right? It's also employing thousands of people to do what is supposedly low wage and low skill work, taking care of others in the healthcare system as nursing assistants, as custodians, as dietary workers, doing clerical and custodial work and food service work within the university, within the hospital. And I increasingly not only noticed this, but came into an encounter with the post-industrial city beyond myself and beyond the place in it I was supposed to occupy through my involvement in graduate student union work when I was at Yale, which was a very major part of grad school for me. And it so happens that Yale is a good place to think through some of these questions, because the graduate students at Yale are in the same union, Unite Here, as the custodial workers and food service workers on campus and the clerical and technical workers on campus. And so, and it's a company town. And so when you engage in conflict with the employer, you realize you are activating kind of one of the central axes of social inequality and social conflict within the whole community. And you realize that everyone around you is implicated in some way. So, we would get involved in local elections, and I would go knock on doors. I've knocked on like every door in New Haven over the course of 8 years. And I would realize there's something I could talk about with everyone, because everyone is touched by this institution in some way. As a landlord, as they're in medical debt, they're employed by it in every possible way, right? And so it came to seem to me that the eds and meds story, it's not that it's untrue and that these kinds of institutions haven't been really important in the remaking of the political economy of the post-industrial city, but rather it's told in this extremely narrow and narrow along racialized and class terms way. And that what I wanted to do was to try to think about the making, in particular in labor market terms, of the eds and meds city as a story that had a working class in it. And what that would mean would be trying to tackle the process of recomposition, remaking of the US working class since deindustrialization, right? So it's not that the story ends when the factory closed in 1979 or 1983, but rather that we would have to pay some attention to the ongoing sets of processes, both which continue to proletarianize people, continue to kind of generate the classic kinds of elements of working class experience, but also which render those same processes relatively more invisible, right? So it's not just like, oh yeah, there was a working class in 1950 and there's one now and it's kind of the same thing, because for some reason, the working class that exists now, that is on the bottom end of the increasing inequality of the country and of the post-industrial city, it doesn't have the same kind of social and political power. It doesn't carry the same kind of cultural weight as, the classic blue collar, mid-century, white, male, industrial working class did at its apex. This became very painfully clear, I think, especially when Trump ran in 2016. And I started collecting those, those newspaper stories where the New York Times or whoever goes to like a steel town or a coal town and they go to the diner, and we've all read a lot of these, right? And I would read them. And in some cases, I would even know, when I went to Western Pennsylvania, I would even know a little bit about the places where they went. And I started noticing that if you actually pay attention to who gets interviewed in these stories, they're interviewing healthcare workers, because actually that's who's there. And often, the nurse, her father is a laid off steel worker or something like that, right? I was well into my project by this point, so I was very primed to notice this. But I'll just wrap up by kind of briefly then summarizing how I tried to kind of make this argument in the book. So it seemed to me that if I wanted to tell the story of the recomposition of the US working class in the post-industrial city, that it would be important obviously not to end the story in the 1970s, which was sort of where a lot of these narratives ended, in my experience, a generation ago. And also not just to start it after that, but rather to tell a story that had the 1970s in the middle, and to show the set of interwoven and intertwined processes that led the New Deal state both to produce a new kind of working class formation, and also to leave and kind of strand that new working class in a different situation than that of the industrial working class. So the basic argument of the book is that once the Cold War started and organized labor became somewhat more constrained and parochial in looking out for its members rather than more ambitious in its ability to pursue kind of broader democratizing and egalitarian project, basically from the end of the 40s onward, part of what it did under those constraints was constructed the public-private welfare state. This is not my idea. This is a now longstanding idea in U.S. history, in which much of social welfare was tiered, right, and the kind of best access to it came through the private sector for organized workers like steel workers in Pittsburgh, and then to service the public, that kind of those private social benefits, a large industry of social welfare provision, again, organized through the private sector, developed in places like Pittsburgh. So a very large healthcare system grew up there to service the really good health benefits that steelworkers won. But that system stood outside of the protections of the New Deal state, right? So hospital workers, for example, were not covered by labor law until the 1970s. They were not covered by the Fair Labor Standards Act until the late 60s. Then when deindustrialization struck, for a set of complicated processes, we can talk more if you want, the insiders of that system shrank over time and the outside grew. So the whole kind of political economy of the New Deal kind of turned inside out. And what we were left with was this very large, unprotected, insecure working class composed very overwhelmingly of women and very heavily of people of color. In places like Pittsburgh, that meant African Americans. Elsewhere, that meant Latinx and immigrant people. So the kind of structural inequality of the New Deal therefore created the basis for a low-wage, insecure working class in deindustrialized cities going forward. And that really, I'll stop here by just saying that really came out of both my trying to understand, like, how can we be talking about inequality without talking about in any seeming detail who is on the bottom end and what the possible sources of resistance to the current situation might be. And then we're trying to kind of get to a second order question about what historical situation created that invisibility that we're now dealing with. So I'll stop there and look forward to further discussion. Thanks.
Thank you, Gabe. Thank you. That was really lovely. I think what was in my little notes, what do I have here? This way of rethinking these narratives, what I really appreciate about the next shift is that it's in the way that it is very much a bottom-up book, that it's looking really to understand what it means to be working class in a post-industrial world. And that is something that I think historians are still grappling with, to say the least. So, all right, I would like to move this discussion a little bit to thinking more about not just the writing process, but like, what does it actually take to get a first book out. So we'll open the floor to all three panelists at once to participate in this, but just a sort of general question of what resources did you find helped you finish this project? What resource, I mean, not just get started, right? Because we all know that I'm pretty sure that everyone's work is coming out of our dissertation research in this way, but what is it that helped you get the project finished? How did you set your timeline for completion? How did you get it across the finish line? Are there any people who were critical in helping you accomplish these goals? Just sort of the big picture of what it took to get a project like this done before we actually get down to the nitty gritty of, you know, working on the book proposal, writing the monograph, getting revisions back, peer review, stuff like that. So we'll go out sort of large scale, thinking about what it took to get it done before we get into the little stuff. And the floor is open, just wherever and however y'all would like to begin.
I can go and I can be brief. I think resources, you, Anthony, mentioned the Charles Warren Center was great, really great formative space for me. I had a postdoc there and only had to teach one class in the fall, which kind of opened things up for the spring quarter. And so that was just as a space, the time, the colleagues who were at the Warren Center were great in reading drafts. Shout out to Megan Black, Chris Clement, especially. So I think, I mean, the short and sweet of it for me is I had postdocs and fellowships, which just kind of gave me the time without, you know, competing obligations. You know, I think I'll give also shout out to my wife, you know, so to kind of reading drafts and kind of helping me with the prose, especially the introduction. And Anthony, you said we can get into the nitty gritty later, but, you know, for me, the big challenge was how to write about bond finance in accessible ways, how to kind of highlight the politics of, I mean, we all would say, of course, interest rates are political, changing interest rates regimes are political, but how to talk about yield and stuff in accessible ways. And so the ability to have someone who was not a historian, not familiar at all with bond finance, kind of read the work was really, really crucial to helping me finish the project. So yeah, I think space, time, and close ones who were distant enough from the work to be able to kind of help me translate the kind of the technicalities of finance in accessible ways. And then, of course, can't forget the manuscript workshop at the University of Chicago. I mean, it was an extraordinary day-long session where David Frund and Tom Segru came out, and my colleagues in the history department from political science and anthropology basically read the entire manuscript. And that was just an extraordinary session where we talked about narrative strategy, kind of questions of character development, whether or not certain characters and themes dropped out, and if so, what were the consequences? And so that's a long way of saying that, you know, obviously, and folks know this, like people, relationships, and folks willing to kind of go on a journey with you without trying to necessarily shape and redirect the story you're ultimately trying to tell, kind of lay out at the very beginning, this is what I want the project to do. This is what I want how I want the story to proceed, and if folks willing to go on the journey with you, and but nevertheless kind of holding you accountable if based off of the terms, right, like characters drop out or the arc sort of falls flat. So that was really tremendous in helping me finish the project.
I also, like Destin, I mean, what's coming to mind is how important it was to have other people read the work and give feedback. And there's something maybe about like the gendered and Midwestern way in which I was raised that like once it felt like other people were also invested in this project, and I'd like ask them like for invest of their time, like, will you read this chapter? It became all the more urgent that it actually like at some point, see the light of day. But also, a lot of times those conversations, whether it was like a workshop in my department, or I was also at the Warren Center for a year, or going to conferences, those conversations where people helped me refine my ideas or ask new questions were also really energizing, right? Gave me sort of new momentum to work on the project. And I think we all know how easy it is to feel like the momentum is is sort of disappearing, is wearing thin. So really seeking out other scholars who can give you honest and encouraging feedback, right? They're gonna try to make the work more excellent, not just right. You don't want to find folks who are just trying to zing you for not remembering a date. You want to find folks who are trying to make you more excellent. And then I'll be transparent too, that you'll see my CV is very thin aside from the book. And so another sort of point that comes to mind is making the book a priority, and then also thinking about what other things cannot be priorities. So for full disclosure, I have had 2 kids since being in my position, and they really slowed things down, but also like I was not willing or interested in working like 60-hour weeks once I had children. So I didn't, right? So I have a book that I feel really proud of, but I also don't have a lot of other publications that I prioritized in the last few years. And I'm eager to get onto this next stage where it feels like, I have the momentum of the first book and some more confidence in myself as a scholar, and then also more regular childcare. So just to throw that out there too.
Well, I was going to say, I don't have 2 kids, but otherwise I was going to say something relatively similar to Destin and Becky, but let me maybe try to say something else instead. The process that my book is about is not one that anybody planned or many people even really noticed. It was gradual. It happened at a kind of molecular level in social life over the course of years. And I realized to make the argument I was trying to make, I was going to have to do a certain kind of interpretive work with the kind of facts and evidence of everyday social life, because, very rarely would the people I was studying say, here is what this thing means, right? Instead, they would say like, in the archive in one form or another, they would say some version of like, God, I guess someone has to look after dad next week. I'm going a couple job interviews. I don't know how we're going to do that, and I would have to put together what that meant in terms of this larger landscape of changing health policy and changing labor markets. And I don't think that would have been something I would necessarily have known how to do, or not saying I know how to do it fully now, but I think I got a lot of practice doing that. Again, from the work of doing political organizing and really trying to figure out how to, in conversation with people, in many cases, people who were socially quite different from me, make larger sense out of things that we were going through in some way together. If anyone who's ever done any kind of political organizing, but especially more intense kinds, there's a lot of like trying to draw out connections between, how your landlord or your employer and my employer have treated us and what that might mean. How did it come to be this way? And is this different from how our parents were treated? Do we remember? Just like trying to actually put together the evidence of everyday life, often in very intimate and small scale, like my boss said this kind of weird thing to me. What does that mean? Trying to put that into some larger historical frame. That's actually what you do when you're trying to do organizing, right? You say, well, that's actually not about you, right? It's not about me. That's about this thing that's happening in our workplace, this thing that's happening in our city. And, here's what we could do about that because it's this larger thing that's not about us. And I really, I think there's all different kinds of this sort of thing that one can do. But for me, it was hugely formative just in trying to figure out how to make meaning out of the evidence of everyday life, how to make historical meaning out of it. Beyond the generosity of many, many colleagues and, whatever fellowships and support along the way, all of which was indispensable to the project. And I couldn't have done it without that. But I think, my colleagues here have covered that well. This was an added element that I think taught me how to think in a different kind of way about history.
That makes all the sense. Thank you. Thank you guys for that. The next sort of question I have is, as I said, a little more nuts and bolts, nitty gritty, and it's about the book proposal. So how did you all, get the proposal together? How did you shop it to editors, to presses? What were some of the factors that helped you decide what press to publish with? I know that there's a lot of inside baseball stuff, or maybe not inside baseball, inside history stuff that you may not want to get too deep into, but just to give, early career scholars a sort of sense of what does it actually take to get from the idea of a manuscript to actually getting it under contract, to get into a place where, you know, you can get some pressure to get it finished, to get a deadline to get it done.
I can start with this one. So I submitted my PhD in the spring of 2018, and I knew I was going on the market, I think the second time that fall. And I wanted to go on the market with a contract in hand. I just thought that would be, you know, one helpful thing I could do. And obviously what is a difficult environment. And so I got myself introduced through whatever connections I could find. And this is one of the ways that the, you know, inequalities of academia manifest themselves, right? How can you get connected to editors? But it's very helpful if there's someone who can vouch for you, introduce you to an editor. So I got myself introduced to editors at 4 or 5 presses that I was sort of interested in. And I'd written a kind of like, not a fully grown proposal, but a kind of like, you know, proposal for a proposal. So I could have something to show. And, you know, I talked to a few of them on the phone. This is kind of, you know, once, right, if you're kind of vouched for and you see in this particular way, then, you know, I could kind of get an audience with a handful of them. Just, you know, I picked them by who has published books that I think are cool and interesting, basically. And I think that's what I would more or less recommend, just who publishes the things you like. And then, to be honest, I wound up with Harvard University Press because it moved the fastest. And I think that was because you know, they were trying to kind of move in a slightly more trade direction. And, you know, because I'd done some non-academic writing, they thought that they might be able to sell my book and get it reviewed and that kind of thing. And, you know, I didn't make a substantive, I mean, it worked out well and I was happy with it, but I didn't make a substantive choice like, yes, I want to go with Harvard University Press. I made a choice that I wanted to get something under contract with one of these 5 or 6 places as soon as I could. And that was the one that came through. And I think that's fine, to be honest. And I basically recommend that kind of approach. Like, you know, you should pick the kinds of places you're interested in, I think, and where you can get connected to. But it's not clear to me that it's a kind of make or break decision necessarily, or that it matters a huge amount substantively for the kind of book that you're going to write. I don't know if my colleagues here would agree.
I agree with what Gabe said, and kind of wish that I'd known it earlier, right? Because I had a similar kind of trajectory, right? I met some editors at conferences, right, where I had presented my work, and then someone, you know, approached me afterwards from a press to talk about the project, and then, you know, we had to sit down at like the book table at the conference, and I had a few of those. But I really stressed myself out about which of the 2 series that I was interested in that I was going to sort of decide to go with. They were both on the table, and in hindsight, I feel like I would have been proud of the book and happy to work with either press because of the humans that I met who I would have been working with that would have been fabulous, and that also had both, right, produced really excellent work at their 2 different presses. And so I kind of wish that I would have been a little more, you know, easy breezy about either one is going to be fine, instead of as stressed out as I was about which choice to make.
Yeah, I love the question. I love hearing the responses because it's the journeys are very individualized, even if there are some general patterns. For me personally, let's see, the kind of points I want to highlight is the importance of relationships. So the UHA, I gave my first it's kind of a coming out party, I suppose you could say. It was basically my first presentation of my work outside of Stanford, where I did my PhD. And I'll never forget, it was an extraordinary panel. David Front was there, Nate Conley, Paige Glosser, a lot of folks, you know, a lot of good people in the house that day. And afterwards, it was Tim Manell, who was the acquisition editor at the University of Chicago, who reached out to me, kept reaching out to me. And so it was relationships, actually. It was my relationship with him. And I like to think about, there's this kind of saying in music production, for instance, somebody like Jay Dill is your favorite producer's producer, right? To me, Tim Manell gets gets the work in a way that a lot of folks do not. They may get the general sort of argument, but I think he was somebody who from the very beginning was able to have substantive conversations and also respect my vision for the work. It actually wasn't until maybe May 2020, almost 6 years later, that I entered a contract with the University of Chicago. I hadn't shopped the project or proposal with anyone else. He was the person who I felt most comfortable with. And I was really fortunate to get a job at the University of Chicago without a book contract. So I always just kind of felt like I didn't need that to get a job, really blessed in that way. And that gave me the space to just kind of tell my story. So by the time I came to the University of Chicago Press, I had all my chapters drafted. And I just gave them the manuscript. And so all that is to say that relationships really matter. For me at least, and people I could trust with the project and who knew the project intimately. The University of Chicago has a great kind of urban politics series. And I kind of thought, well, maybe I would publish my book with that series, but ultimately decided not to do that, in part because I kind of felt comfortable in my reputation among the urban historians by that point. Had been 6 years I presented and felt like the urbanists would gravitate to the book. And I didn't want to lose the chance to reach and speak to people working on questions of governance and democracy and questions of finance. So that was a choice, a decision I made. And I was willing, there's a way in which, like, if you don't publish in a series, it's kind of like being no man's land. And so I was a little worried about that as well, but ultimately decided to not have it be in a series. And mostly because by that point in time, I felt very comfortable and confident in the feedback I had gotten from so many different colleagues. I knew what story I wanted to tell. Tim and Nell, like I said, my colleagues at the University of Chicago who participated in the book manuscript workshop. And so there's a way in which, like, you could have too many cooks in the kitchen after a while. And for me, I felt good about the feedback I had received, and so ultimately decided not to publish it with the series. I mean, we could talk about the difference between, I think all of us obviously have published our work on academic presses. The difference, these academic presses, to my mind, are great at acquiring books. I don't know if they're necessarily the best at selling books. And so, we can think a little bit about the work it takes to kind of promote your work beyond just what the press may offer themselves, if that's useful to folks down the line. But that's a little bit of my experience, and happy to say more.
I mean, it was a great book, Destin. So, I mean, whatever happened, it worked out, But I think we should go there. There are certainly some questions I have about writing process, but since you brought it up, I mean, this is part of the point of this panel. How have you all been able to promote your work during a pandemic and quarantine? I mean, there's been so much going on, teaching on Zoom, all the conferences have been canceled. It's hard to do. I don't know what type of invited lectures and whatnot y'all have been able to be a part of, but the academic game really came to a halt over the last year. So can you all tell me a little bit more just about what you've been able to do to share your work with people, to build your audience, to figure out who your audience is, who are the people who you may have expected or may not have expected to be interested in your work, how to reach them? Just what have you been able to do to make sure that, your scholarship is being disseminated widely and broadly?
I can pick up if that's okay. No, it's a great question. I think the thing I've been most surprised by is I think the historians have come a little later to the project, if I may. It's been the finance crowd who, whether it be municipal regulators with the Municipal Securities Rulemaking Board, or folks who are bond rating analysts or financiers who have invited me to a ton of talks, who have purchased the book, because they see it as there's a way in which the municipal bond market and its major market makers kind of present themselves as kind of the architects of a civic good, right? They're the ones who channel investment and the savings of investors and institutional and wealthy investors into the needs of cities. And they are the kind of noble actors compared to the folks in the corporate bond market or your stock traders, your vulture capitalists. And then my book comes around and says that actually there's some, it's deeply complicit in wealth, spatial, and racial inequalities. And so they were kind of shaken by that. Maybe I don't want to overstate, but at least forced to take up that proposition. And it's been incredible to kind of be in a room with these folks because they generally agree on the history and the arc. They disagree on the solution, that is to say, to kind of decommodify and decouple the needs of cities from the market. But they have, and really, I think the other point here is obvious, is the context. I mean, where you have the uprisings of last summer and all of these corporate firms forced to kind of engage in some kind of racial reckoning, whatever that means. And so I think the timing of the book was really worked out quite nicely, and got a lot of folks talking about it in the financial world. And really blessed and thankful that now my other colleagues who have been so busy teaching and writing their own great scholarship are also engaging with the work. So I've been surprised, in other words, by, I guess, the order of operations, with folks in the private sector actually reading the work really attentively.
Yeah, I feel like I have not done a great job promoting my work. So I'll say that, right? So I had sort of been informed by some colleagues that when it came to the promotion, much like Destin said, that I would kind of have to hustle, right? That the press would do some, but if I wanted, to try to get speaking engagements or go to, community bookstores, especially as someone who writes about community activism, those were contacts I was going to have to try to make on my own and to sort of work to do that. And so, before the pandemic, I anticipated that that's what I would do. But to be honest, the consequence of the book coming out during the pandemic has been that I have had very little capacity to do that kind of hustling. I'm just not there right now. Just to be transparent, but I've been lucky enough, right, talking again about how supportive the crew of urban historians is at this sort of moment, right, that something like this is a really amazing opportunity for me, that I had the invitation. I also did a talk with Paige Glotzer, a kind of joint book talk, since our books came out during the pandemic, and we cover similar topics, and she's an amazing person to be in conversation with. But again, that was another instance in which, right, our professional association sort of reached out to kind of lift us up. And I also, but I did have, I was interested in the reception that the book had among the sort of modern monetary theory folks, who I think are some really important scholars for us as urban historians to connect with and learn from. But since so much of my book was about the historical specificity of ideas about the ways that banks ought to behave, and right, what I was calling financial common sense in the book, and sort of pointing out the ways in which historical actors had ideas about banks that didn't necessarily reflect the reality of how banks worked, right? That was a message that was really well received by that crew of scholars. And so for me, it's been really exciting to sort of connect with folks outside the discipline of history about what historians and humanists can bring to conversations about money.
I'll say I had a kind of strange experience of publicizing and promoting the work in the context of the pandemic, in that my book was about healthcare workers and about how healthcare workers have played this kind of unheralded and undervalued role in holding society together through crisis. And the crisis I meant wasn't this one, but there was a point actually. So the book was finished, like I submitted the final draft of it in spring of 2020. And there was a point in that summer talking about what to call it, when the press actually proposed calling it essential workers. I'm glad we didn't do that for various reasons, but that gives you an idea of, the way that this particular context was very good for the promotion of my book, which feels terrible to say because it's such a terrible context, but that is how it played out for me. I think that on top of that, I'll say that HUP I've whatever normal complaints and criticisms and things I think worked well and so on in the editorial process, but on the publicity side, they do really show up, and we're able to really kind of like set off a wave of publicity, I think in part thanks to the pandemic thing, in part that just like contingently thanks to, like I said before, I have some number of like relationships and, connections and presence in a kind of like left-wing New York media world type thing. And so the combination of those meant that the book got a ton of publicity, which is, exciting and fun. Although I'll say also I wouldn't pursue single-mindedly, in that obviously I wrote the book because I care about things going on in the present, and that's what motivates it. And there's political commitments that underlie it. I wanted to be in conversation with the present, and it's about as presentist as a history book can be. I mean, it kind of ends around the year 2000. But it's not literally about the present, right? And I found myself very often getting asked to put it directly into conversation with the present. And I can try to do that, and I can try to say, well, this thing I found about the 1980s means this other thing about what's going on in the pandemic or whatever. And, I'm not totally bullshitting when I do that. It's based in some knowledge, but it's not based in deep research about, what it's like in the present right now, because I'm a historian. And so I think that's a real challenge, actually, that historians face in publicizing our work, is that understandably, audiences want us to bring the work to bear directly on the present. It's not inappropriate. I think that they want us to do that. And I think it's not inappropriate to try to do that, but it's also hard to do that well. And I found myself getting over your skis, is that the expression? Getting out ahead of myself in some way, in trying to do that. And that, actually there are people in the present who know obviously much, much more about it than I do.
And I just want to build on that, because I thought that was brilliant. And I think I'm kind of going through a little bit of an identity crisis along those lines, because I get asked to speak so much. People are willing to entertain the history. And then there's almost a kind of philosophy of history at work. Okay, that was the past. It's different now, right? Surely. And so there's like this pull, again, among folks within the financial world, especially, and even, policymakers, progressive policymakers, local officials, to kind of assess the present. And then what happens is I find myself speaking a lot about the present, and then I almost kind of lose sight of the audience. So like even yesterday I was on a plenary, and my comments were so had moved so far away from the state of the field, the kind of what are the key questions for urban historians, to kind of speak specifically about the present and about what we do about some of the existential crises. So I think I just wanted to say thank you to Gabe, because what you just did helped me make sense of this dissonance, if you will, between kind of speaking about the past, the present, and why it is that sometimes I'm able to, sometimes I misdiagnose the audience. And in many ways, okay, that's a consequence. Okay, people are interested in the book and what I have to say, but it also means I'm kind of trying to move across different temporal zones, if you will, and it doesn't always feel comfortable. And so I guess that's the way I would kind of punctuate that set of rambling remarks, is to say that like there are consequences to speaking, to being a public intellectual, to trying to speak to the present moment, that I wasn't fully aware of, right? I was just like, okay, this is going to lead to people engaging the work, and maybe people will make some changes based off of what I've offered in the project. But then myself forced to kind of present and work as the academic, as somebody trying to, make an intervention in the present, trying to think about the history, trying to think about the present. It does create a kind of, really a dissonance that shows up during panels or across other mediums.
I don't want to cut you all off, but I actually want to build on this question, because it's a question of audience. So has your audience changed in your mind since you began writing to where the book has wound up? And I ask this question, not just thinking, broadly about, okay, who our audience is for, but thinking more so of when you were writing this book, like when you were actually sitting down, you wake up, you get your coffee, you get in your little, in the writing routine, whatever, what have you. are the people who you thought you were writing this book for, are they still the folks who you're engaging with? Or has the audience changed over time? And how do you think that has affected not just the way your scholarship is received, but even the way you understand your own scholarship?
I can try to answer that. I mean, something that related to the last discussion, something that's happened in the development of my book is that I really conceived it in dialogue and in relation to debates within labor history, fundamentally, more than any other kind of subfield and more than any other particular intellectual genealogy within the historical field. And that, I think, is still the core of the book. That is really like, it's the key set of interventions are there. But I built up a set of interventions around that over time as I developed the argument and figured out what does that have to do with health policy, what does it have to do with urban history, et cetera, that, hopefully they represented efforts to broaden it. And, that became like, that led the book to develop by the time it was like but the dissertation manuscript and then the early phases of the book manuscript to develop into a certain kind of like kludge, because it was trying to do a bunch of different, to speak to a bunch of different audiences and, in a bunch of different repertoires and vocabularies. And it still has some of that going on, but I think that's an important part of the, from my perspective, a relatively healthy part of the kind of revision process is, you start in one place, you figure out the different kind of arguments and things you're engaged with and kind of add them onto what you're doing, like just sort of nailing another board onto it or whatever, and then, okay, now you've submitted your dissertation, now you're turning it into a book, now you may be revising the first draft of your book, whatever, and you have to make it look like a seamless thing, rather than something that you built by kind of whacking on a new board here and so on. And that's aesthetic work in terms of writing, obviously, but I think there's also a real intellectual work in doing that. I mean, figuring out like the kind of layers of, scholarly discourse are meaningful and important, but you also do want to kind of climb down a level under those, right? Or up, I'm not sure if it's up or down in this metaphor, and try to actually figure out, what is the kind of, is there a single story you're telling that encompasses and touches on these kind of different elements of a historical conversation and brings them together such that people can see things in a new way, as opposed to like just seeing your book and your work as another iteration of something someone else has already done. That's, I guess, one thing I would say. The other is that, I really did, as I've said before, I really did want to tell my book through the perspectives and the eyes and the voices of ordinary people and their everyday experiences and how those have historical weight and meaning. And, my hope was that would make it enjoyable to read, like, because it's just like, it's about normal people going through life. And that's interesting to me. But there was some analytical work I had to do to, build that up into something of historic, that I could show how that is of historical significance. And I'll say that when in kind of insecure moments when I look at like the Amazon reviews of my book or whatever, there's a recurring theme of like, this got sold to me as like a kind of interesting, like popular history of, the healthcare industry or the new economy or Pittsburgh where I live or whatever. And then I opened it up and it's very academic. And I don't really have a problem with that, but it's like it's in that moment where I realized like, okay, trying to build up everyday people's lives and experiences into historical weight that registers across multiple subfields and is also like accessible in a popular way. I'm really not going to be able to please everyone probably. And that's fine. And I'm sorry for people to whom Harvard University Press has done a bait and switch. But I feel like, it's good to think consciously about that stuff and also like to accept limits around what you're going to be able to balance.
I feel like I started the project, right, like excited about writing a history of a social movement, and I was thinking about the way that social movement histories could speak to political historians primarily, I would say, right? But it was really following the sources that made me realize I was going to have to grapple with some of this history of finance stuff. And I remember the moment sort of late in dissertating when I realized that this story was also going to be about the way that the New Deal financial regime sort of crumbled and changed over time. And I was kind of like, oh shit, right? Like this, I was not interested in, I didn't start out interested in banks and right, trying to figure out things like how the Federal Reserve affects interest rates and that kind of thing. So in that sense, I still wanted to make the book one that would be accessible to people who also would see that it was about banks and say, oh shit, I don't want to learn about banks, right? To sort of keep that audience in mind. And we'll see sort of how that goes when the reviews start coming in. But and I was also trying to think about a lot of times when I'd imagine my audience, I would think about someone in my life who was, I think about my brother, who is a person who is very interested in things. It would be like, read this article, you have to listen to this podcast, right? He's like always interested in ideas, but he for sure doesn't have any books by an academic press on any of his bookshelves. So it's like when he inevitably like has to buy this and he opens it, will it be like, oh, Becky, this isn't bad? Or it's like he stops after page 10. And I haven't talked to him yet about what happened when he read it. So stay tuned. But a little bit of change over time with the audience, I would say.
Yeah, I begin the kind of genesis of the book comes out of a seminar paper during my second year. City planning emphasis. I was thinking about how city planners with the Department of City Planning and renewal agencies kind of tried to reimagine downtown space to kind of dislocate what was once the location and site for a wholesale produce market to expand its commercial office building to, again, kind of build out the office space for the fire sector. So it was very much, I wanted to speak to urban historians by way of focusing in on planning, the kind of planning work and intellectual work that goes into planning space around the expanding fire sector. It changed for different reasons, which was not really my point. But one thing I want to say is that you can't really control how the book gets characterized. And that is really intriguing, right? Like you can say, here are the themes, the topics, here are the arguments. And then kind of what Gabe said, he was like, this book got sold to me as, you cannot really control how a book gets read, so to speak. And I'll never forget Keeanga Yamada Taylor had said something like, on the front cover, Michelle Alexander describes the book as a horror story of racial capitalism. She's like, that's an interesting characterization. I think it's this way in which the moment the social movements around the book or the context in which a book is released informs the ways in which people read it and how they present it and characterize it. So for me, I also was working on an edited volume on the histories of racial capitalism. And actually in my main book, I think I used the expression racial capitalism once. And so it's interesting to hear people describe my book as a story of racial capitalism. I wouldn't describe it in that way, but I don't get to choose. What I get to do is choose the kind of terms of debate to hope that people will take me up on the interpretive claims and evaluate me based off of whether or not I speak to those interpretive claims and deliver on the promise. But I don't get to control how it gets packaged, marketed, and so forth. The context kind of dictates that. And in some ways also how people are trying to make sense of multiple intellectual projects, right? Like for me, the volume plus the book, I think leads some people to characterize the book as part of a broader meditation on the history of racial capitalism, even though I would never, I really did try to see those as distinct and separate projects for different reasons. So anyway, I think that's something for folks in the room as well, is like you put it out there and then people will stamp it in a way that to some extent may flow from the publisher and the ways in which they market it, but it comes from it's the characterizations come from many different other quarters that again you can't really control.
Well, this isn't like an official book review or anything, but if I had to characterize the text that I read, because I haven't had a chance to read all three, I would say classic, classic, classic. All of these are classic texts, especially if we start thinking of this field of cities under fire of this post-war trend. I mean, really, I don't know if I want to say post-60s, but certainly, you know, when we're thinking of the last third of the 20th century, right? So from 65 onward, this theme that you all are engaging with finance, healthcare, real estate, thinking of the different ways these things are working together in cities. I think that the three texts that you all have published this past year are really going to wind up, you know, laying a foundation for future scholarship in this subject. So that's just, you know, personal take, but I want to get a chance to start moving towards some audience questions. So I have a couple more questions that are lined up. Audience members, if you all have any questions, you can start to drop them in the chat. And you know, we're going to have a little bit longer of a conversation among us panelists. Once we get through this phase of the discussion, then we'll be able to open up for audience questions. So if there's anything that you want to ask the three panelists that we have, please drop it in the chat. We'll get an opportunity to move forward with those questions after this. But to start summing up our conversation, the conversation that we're having together, I want to go back to this idea of fire, because I do really see this as sort of a trend within urban history. As you said, all of our work is coming out of this 08 financial crisis. You know, it's influenced an entire generation of scholarship at this point. So my question for y'all is thinking of what are some of the scholars, what are some of the texts, what are some of the books that inspired your craft, that inspired your interest in this subject? But moreover, thinking of this research of fire, like what are the future directions that you think the field should take? And I say that not in the sense of like define the state of the field, but really like what are some of the research questions that came up in your work that, you know, kind of gave you an understanding of urban history that you didn't see before? And what are some of the things that maybe if you have time to respond to this that were left out of the manuscript, but that you think are really rich in the sense of allowing us to understand how fire, how these fire industries wind up influencing urban development? So just thinking about that, you know, to sum it up real tight, people who have published, you know, the sort of precursors for this field, as where you see the precursors for your work, maybe some books you're trying to knock off the shelf. So thinking about it in that way, but just thinking about how fire in general is going to wind up, you know, being a trend within urban history and some of the future directions you see it going in.
Can I start? Because there's actually something I have been thinking about since Destin came to the talk that I got to do with Paige when I was so lucky to do that. But you asked a question about chronology during that conversation about the, do you remember they asked this question? I'll tell you. I've been thinking about it obsessively. So like this question about like what new questions come about if we center fire in urban history? Right. I think one of them that Dustin brought up the last time I saw him was about sort of chronological bookends and things that look like turning points when you center fire as opposed to federal policy or local elections and that kind of thing. And back in May, when I last saw Dustin, I hadn't like scribbled all over his book yet. But now that I have, it's just like, is there a case to be made that like the credit crunch of 1966 is like a crucial turning point in urban history, right? It's like possibly, right? Or thinking about the way that the Volcker experiment, right, sort of changed the conditions, created new constraints for cities. But I have a question for my fellow panelists about the way that their projects have made them think about chronology, but it's like a question I stole from Destin. But I've been dying to ask, so.
Yeah, well, I will try to respond to that and to Anthony's question. You know, if I had to name, I think one book I was sort of trying, not directly, but sort of in a vaguer way to imitate, it would be Golden Gulag by Ruth Wilson Gilmore. And let me come back to why, maybe by way of Becky's question and trying to engage with that. So, you know, for me, I was interested in remaking labor markets. I realized, okay, the largest workforce now in every city in America, and especially even more so in formerly industrial cities, is the healthcare workforce. Why did that come to be? What's up with that? You know, and that I realized that was going to become a question about healthcare finance, and especially about health insurance, right? Because the healthcare system is financed by consumer payments in the form of insurance. And all of, you know, I mean, that's a very deep and rich and complicated field that exists almost entirely outside of history, right? In health policy, in health economics, and has its own periodization, to go to Becky's question, right? And it was a kind of big effort for me, and it really became very analytically important for me to try to absorb into the kind of narrative of U.S. history, urban history, labor history, et cetera, that I was engaged with, to absorb the kind of different periodization and chronology of healthcare, health insurance, and healthcare finance into that. So, for example, a key moment for me was when I realized that, 1979, the Volcker shock is this key episode in deindustrialization, and that we knew already, right? That the Fed jacks up interest rates, factories across the country close over a period of a few years. Places like Pittsburgh, unemployment was nearly 20% in Pittsburgh for several years. So the second Great Depression happened in blue collar America. And that we knew. But I realized that the Volcker shock channeled investment into the healthcare industry, as opposed to sucking it out the way it sucked it out of, steel, for example. And that moreover, all of the social distress that followed on it channeled consumption, channeled demand into the healthcare industry. And so there was like some totally weird thing happening where the normal, what I think of as like the ups and downs of the business cycle and then the changing kind of politics and political economy around that, was running opposite to the chronology that I thought. But then if you looked at it from the perspective of health finance and health insurance, you could kind of connect these and start to see another narrative that bridges 1979 in a different kind of way. And so, I think like that was really, really important for me. Exactly the kinds of questions that I guess Destin raised at this panel and that you're raising now, Becky, were really important for me. And to connect it to Gilmore to wrap up, the thing that book does so powerfully and was so important for me was showing how changing flows of finance and investment and capital, it's not enough to show where there's money and, to like the kind of sort of vulgar history of capitalism of just like money pursues the highest return. That's important. That has to be part of our story. But actually, right, that process is linked to social control and social power in really fundamental ways, and the reproduction of social hierarchies. And I came to see this parallel when I got into especially old age policy in the late 70s. And I did this project on nursing home abuse. And I realized in the late 70s, there was a national wave of nursing home abuse scandals that just forced me to think about the rise of the carceral state happening in the same moment, right? Nursing homes aren't the same as prisons. We shouldn't collapse them with each other. But like you could see like, oh, there is this thing happening where whatever the flows of capital are in this moment, whatever the kind of flows and surpluses of state power are and state capacity, as Gilmore puts it, are causing people to be held inside institutions in abusive ways across multiple sort of kinds of social institutions. And so again, the kind of like unexpected chronology, and again, the kind of Gilmore type attention that I was trying to imitate to how surpluses of state capacity and surpluses of capital allow for certain changes in kinds of governance and social control was really important for me. I guess I'll stop there.
Yeah, I think these are all just great questions. Anthony, I'll come back to your question about kind of future directions and stuff that fell out or only, proved promising, but I couldn't develop in the book. Just speaking really quickly, the chronology, when I kind of began graduate school, was kind of imagining myself as an urban historian, big books then and now, of course, Tom Segru, Origins of the Urban Crisis, American Babylon. I mean, I can go on and on. And to my mind, I mean, folks could disagree here, but the chronology there was kind of 1945 to the mid 1970s. For self, it was the tax revolt of, Prop 13 in 1978. For others, it might have been 1980. But as I understood that literature was kind of trying to make sense of three stories. One, the arc of or the emergence of deindustrialization, the origins of deindustrialization, the rise of Reagan Democrats, the sort of collapse of the New Deal coalition, and the kind of civil rights, post-civil rights story. Very little on the kind of post-civil rights aspect, the kind of what does Black politics look like well into the 1980s, which is what Kianga kind of really pushed us to think about last night in last night's plenary. But it was kind of 1945 to the early 80s to try to make sense of those three stories. And for me, I was intrigued by or kind of moved by 1966, as Becky kind of mentioned, right, as the credit crunch. And for me, it necessitated not thinking about the post-war war years, not as a kind of singular a singular period with historic shape, all leading us toward deindustrialization or the rise of the kind of Reagan Democrats or the kind of post-civil rights moment, but to think about the movement from a low interest rate regime to a high interest rate regime. And so for me to think about 45 to 1966 as kind of setting, allowing for a set of priorities, borrowing possibilities that changed dramatically after 1966. And so to me, then the turning point was not necessarily 73 or not necessarily 78 even, but really 1966 by way of thinking about our bookends, not in terms of federal policy, which is usually how it was told in urban history, Housing Act of 1937, 49, 68, but in terms of distinct interest rate regimes. And so, but that made sense for me as I was thinking about the kind of shifting terms of borrowing terms in the bond market. But I also see something of this, a kind of rethinking the major turning points or watersheds in the work of people like Russell Rickford, Elizabeth Hinton, who are thinking about not just the credit crunch as a decisive moment, a turning point in 20th century American history, but the urban uprisings as catalyzing radical experimentation around education with the freedom schools, for instance, in the case of Russell Rickford, or mass incarceration. Or of course, thinking about of the forms of predatory inclusion and insisting on a new kind of way of investment in cities that obviously, Becky, you talk about. So I see a number of folks kind of moving away or challenging that 45 to 78 framework to really think about the mid-1960s as a turning point, and not just because of, social movement protests, though obviously that is central, right, for the reasons Becky, in the ways Becky brilliantly describes in After Redlining. Anthony, you asked a question about kind of stuff that we wish we could have talked about, or that, maybe we will talk about. There is life after the first book, thankfully. Towards the end, in the epilogue, I was really intrigued by this idea that the identities of bondholders were kind of changing, right? There's a sense that it wasn't just kind of conservative individual investors and institutional investors. There's a sense that in the 1980s, you have the funds from the illicit drug trade, narcotics, being funneled through the bond market, through the purchase of bearer bonds that allow for another kind of money laundering to take place, right? And so really I wished I could have gotten a chance to think more explicitly about the so-called formal and informal market, narcotics, and the municipal bond market, and the ways in which these funds were being funneled through these formal markets in ways that were able to kind of escape the eyes of the Treasury Department and the IRS. So that was something that comes about in the 1980s. And I often get this question. This kind of goes back to what Gabe was saying in terms of Ruthie Gilmore's work. I often get this question like, so how does your story relate to crime and punishment, mass incarceration? If I had more room in the book, I would have kind of developed this angle to be able to speak to that. But for folks who want to get into the IRS records, to think about bearer bonds and the narcotics trade, I think there's a way in which you could think about the dynamics at the municipal bond level of the municipal bond market and narcotics trafficking in the 1980s.
Should I talk about what I left out? So yeah, in terms of, thanks for letting me ask my question in the middle of your question too, Anthony. It was just like itching. But I mean, I feel like the books that I scribbled on the most during the writing process were some that Destin had mentioned, but also Amanda Seligman's Block by Block and Becky Nicolaides' My Blue Heaven were really helpful for thinking about how to think about telling the story at the community level while also being really interested in the policy implications. Those were sort of model books for me too. But yeah, there's a lot more work to be done on the reinvestment movement that I was sad that I couldn't include too, right? So I suggest in a lot of moments in the book that their agenda was much more capacious, but I'm like following this this sort of bank-based reinvestment strand to tell the story. But they were also really angry about insurance redlining, right? Which Ben Ansfield just had that great JH article come out about the FAIR program, but there's more work to be done there too. And I write about the reinvestment movement through this national network that was called National People's Action. But National People's Action had member organizations, right, like upwards of 300, right, at its peak in communities around the country. And I feel like there's a lot of opportunity to dig into some of the really fine textured local stories of some of these organizations, especially those that kept local archives or that right activists are still around and willing to share their stories through oral histories. But they go on to talk about the importance of affordable energy, of jobs that I really didn't get into. Also, there's a history of the CRA that changes after the bank regulators start to force start to make public the grades that they give to different banks for their Community Reinvestment Act, their ratings. Those have been private until 1989. And I'd be so interested to read the history that talks about how that change in the regulations in the late 80s might have changed the story for community activists too. But yeah, so I hope all of those things are things I wanted to chase down, but it was like I got to stop this at some point. But there's lots more to say, and I hope that I can read more of it from other people, even maybe some who might say I missed something. So it's going to happen sometime, right?
All right. So thank you for that. We are almost at the end of our time. Real quick, I would like to thank the Urban History Association for giving us a platform with their Urban History Month. This, as I said, is a production in this way of the Early Career Committee. We're just a group of young scholars who are interested in figuring out how we can help other young scholars who are interested in urban history. So for all of those of you who may be on this call, not are members of the Urban History Association, please consider joining. By joining is the best way to help us with our efforts. I have Oh my goodness, have I been muted this whole time? Okay, good.
Oh, just for a second.
All right, awesome. Anyway, the point is I've uploaded the link to the Urban History membership in the chat. If you're not a member, please consider joining us. I am down to my last question for you all. And I once again want to thank the panelists, thank Destin, thank Becky, thank Gabe for taking the time to chat with us today. This has been very, not even just interesting, but I think really encouraging, and seeing how this stuff can be done, seeing how to move forward on a project and thinking of new directions that we all can go in, especially, as we continue this conversation of cities under fire. But the final sort of question that I have for y'all is, it's a chance for you to give out your roses. So thinking of who are some of the mentors, who are some of the advisors, who are some of the people who not just helped you with your book project, but have really helped you intellectually and on your journey as a scholar, to help push you along and move you to this point where you're at now, where you have these wonderful contributions that you can make to the field. After that, I'm going to open up the floor for any other broader questions. So if anyone has any questions, please just drop them in the chat and we can take them, field them as they come. But before then, just an opportunity for our panelists to give us some final words, perhaps some final thank yous to the folks who have helped them along their journey thus far.
I can start. I like the thank you part. Well, so I was really grateful to, I'm going to name drop Amanda Seligman again, who I see as just a really wonderful mentor and sort of model community member for urban historians, right? Who is the series editor for my book and who gave me really amazing feedback. And also David Freund, who I have historically and like still to this day, I'm pretty bashful about reaching out and asking people for help, which is actually something that I would say to people who are here who maybe are at a point where they, you know, do need some other folks to look at their work in progress. But it's a regret that I had that I didn't reach out more to say, like, can you, stranger, read, you know, a section of this chapter because I think you're a genius, right? I've gotten a few, can you read this for feedback emails? And I love them. So I wish I would have done it more. But David Freund was somebody who sort of found me at a conference and reached out to me as a kind of, you know, source of support and mentor. And his support has just been invaluable through this process. And then I also just feel like I've really been mentored by a lot of people who I consider my peers, right? And some of them are on this call, but like Ben Holtzman has been just so amazing, and David Stein. So, you know, some other folks that I've met along the way too, but it's been really exciting to see how mentors can also be like people who you're coming up with, I think.
Yeah, I'll echo that. I mean, you know, obviously I was like my dissertation committee and, you know, various teachers I had and many commenters and readers along the way up to and including, yeah, I also did a book workshop in Chicago that was very formative for me. But the thing I really want to underscore is what Becky said, which is that, you know, I think, or I've always found that relationships with my peers, well, in general, how to say this, I think kind of more explicit mentor-mentee type relationships, whether formalized or informal, not always, but often, right, are laden with forms of power that even in the best of cases, it makes the most honest conversation difficult, or can. You know, I had one advisor in graduate school, Michael Denning, who like his whole professional life was about avoiding that. And he really built institutions around himself to allow graduate students to kind of mentor each other kind of with his help. But in general, I think, you know, even the most supportive senior scholars and the most, you know, encouraging ones, even nonetheless then, right, like we want letters from them, or we, you know, there's different things like that, you know, absolutely their support has been critical for me, and it's really important to seek, as Becky is saying. But I think makes it still qualitatively different in some way from the kind of support you can get from colleagues and friends and peers, who, you know, I think it's not just more honest or that it's less laden with something or whatever, but that like they're just more likely to be engaged in the same kind of collective project as us, right? That like, I mean, Ben and David for me too, along with many others, you know, along the way, are like we you know, because we're formed in similar historical moments and are thinking about similar things as a result of that, and have gone through maybe similar social movements and whatever, just like, you know, we're not all doing exactly the same thing, but we're all working on the same kind of problematic in some way. Or I think that's likelier with your colleagues and friends and peers. And so cultivating those kinds of relationships has definitely been really, really important for me too. And so thanks to everyone here who has done that for me.
Yeah, I'll be brief because, you know, Becky and Gabe just really nicely summarized the importance of kind of horizontal mentorship, or, you know, just solidarity basically among friends and colleagues. I just want to kind of give a shout out to my dad. I mean, my dad has been somebody who, before this book project was even a thing, I was in the dining room of my parents' house and he was in the kitchen, and he was just asking me questions and sharing his experience growing up in New York City in the 1970s. And so he's been a champion. He's read my work. He's posed questions. We've had many conversations over the phone. So, you know, there's what you can get from your advisors, from your friends, and then there, you know, just family who just kind of hold you down, who support the work. And really without him, you know, this project would just, I don't think it would have been written. It certainly would have been worse off. So that's just somebody I want to give a shout out to.
That was beautiful. That was beautiful. And I appreciate hearing the way that you all framed that honestly, because there is this way, as much as we need, you know, old heads to help show us the way, we need our peers, really, we need comrades to go on this journey with us. And then we need the lay folks, we need our family, we need our friends, we need the people who help keep us sane, who remind us of the way that there is life outside of that of the mind to really, help keep us grounded as we go on this journey. So it was beautiful hearing the way that you all sort of laid that out. Right now, I would open the floor for questions. I am seeing none in the chat. Oh, did we just get one? Yes, we did, from our friend, longtime friend of the program, Dylan Gottlieb. Do you think that fire is actually a useful category of historical analysis? Or is it a case of us employing somewhat uncritically an ill-defined and fuzzy census category? After all, something like an investment bank has a very different relationship with global capital markets, urban spaces, in particular cities, than say a real estate development. Your all thoughts on that? And I do want to say just real quick, I was thinking of what Becky had said about bookends. And when I'm teaching the survey, obviously if you teach the US history survey, it's generally going to be like what? Till Civil War, and then you're going to split into two. But there's a way of teaching the survey where you can teach it just, and I think someone like Lewis Hyman would do this, he has done this very well, through a series of financial crises. So this idea of the way that we frame the chronology of American history, if we look at it from a federal level, we get one story. But if we look at it, using different sets of markers, we wind up getting different stories. So I'm really glad that Dylan brought this up, because it is an interesting question of what does this fire category do for us as historians? What is it that it provides us with that we wouldn't otherwise get by looking at things such as legislation, or even if we just think of the life and death of social movements, or we look at civic organizations, institutional records, things along those lines. What is it that fire does for us that these other chronologies cannot?
Are we all going to jump on this one at once? That's actually like the question that I was thinking about before the panel was this exact question, right? Like, what is this category analysis? We made this up, right? Just like everything we've created. It's a historical construct to make sense of some industries that seem to have sometimes common interest in public policy, or sometimes common goals, or I'm not really sure. But I think that to me, it seems like some of the most interesting work, including the work of Gabe and Destin, is really conscious of the different ways that we need to sort of split the categories, right? Even I'm thinking here of Destin's construction of the little c, middle C, big C, when talking about the different capital segments that are interested in profiting from housing in San Francisco, but they, just because they are capitalists with some skin in the game in the housing market doesn't mean they all have the same interests. And in fact, they don't, they compete. And then thinking too of Gabe's example of the way that healthcare workers, care workers actually have these solidarities with patients, and that they're both sort of in opposition to, capital in that industry exploiting those conditions, So surprising shared interests and solidarities that don't map neatly onto industry or occupation or those kinds of things. So I've come at this being we need to split this category a lot. And I'm a lot fuzzier about when it should actually be lumped. And now I'll be quiet.
Yeah, I'll jump in. I'm not necessarily invested in, fire as a historical unit of analysis, or using it to make interpretive claims about, the changes in finance, capitalism, and real estate post 45. That was, Anthony, you could correct me if I'm wrong. That was your way of kind of framing the panel and bringing us together. So that I don't know if the panel was necessarily trying to make for a case for the importance or utility of fire. Me personally, I'm interested in drawing attention to bond finance in particular, within, I suppose you could say, the fire sector, though at the same time, the book does try to think about the ways in which specific people within city planning departments, but not just there, sought to expand what they described the census category, I suppose, as finance, insurance, and real estate, and sought to repurpose space to anchor economic growth, in part through financial services and in part through consumption. And the ways in which the people who occupied those new spaces, commercial office buildings, literally invested in their own spatial future. that the book is not really trying to make an argument about the importance or limitations of fire. I suppose we could split it, but I think that, you know, there were folks who imagined there being such a thing called the fire sector, who tried to secure public subsidies to expand the fire sector. That too has, you know, origins and is part of a historical process that folks can, you know, elaborate and discuss. But as a kind of unit of analysis, that's not I'm not interested in that.
Yeah, I mean, I guess just to echo, I don't have a ton to say. I think when fire as a sector is talked about, it typically health insurance is not the eye that people are imagining. And, you know, I was glad to be on this. I was excited to be on this panel and have this conversation to try to think about, okay, what would it mean to actually think of health insurance as part of fire? And I think there's something, there's been something generative for me about doing that. But, you know, obviously health insurance doesn't relate to urban space in the direct kinds of ways that, you know, like, for example, fire insurance. Someone, Becky mentioned Bench's work, but like fire insurance or flood insurance or, you know, other kinds of financial instruments related to urban development do. Health insurance relates to urban space. I mean, I would say quite importantly, actually, but very indirectly, right? You know, I think it's, then we can, that lets me sort of think about, okay, well, you know, there are connections between health insurance and, for example, municipal bond markets, right? Like hospitals borrow and grow and take over neighborhoods using municipal bond markets based on the guarantee that they're going to be able to continue to collect health insurance payments. But it's pretty uncoordinated. And I think it makes it hard. I don't think they really necessarily form like a classic growth coalition or something like that, a political bloc that we could identify. And so I think fire for me poses a question about like a larger structural growth model, maybe the role in particular of the state in financing and encouraging certain kinds of urban development. But I wouldn't want to go to your question, Dylan, I wouldn't want to go too far in saying like fire, at least the fire people I know, like are an identifiable constituent, coherent constituency or something like that.
Thank you guys for those responses. I gotta say, I thought that it was a good panel title. That was my primary investment in the fire as a way of bringing us all together. But I think that the conversation that has helped facilitate and thinking through what that means, that was very helpful to hear. So hopefully we'll come up with some new historical construct that perhaps does a better job of bringing these different segments together. Okay, seeing no other questions in the chat, I'm gonna take this time to once again, thank you. Thank you to our panelists. Congratulations on your work. I cannot recommend these texts enough. The Early Career Committee, we are hosting another event at the end of the month for how shall we say it, Beyond the Professorate. It's the beginning of a speaker series that we're hoping to host. This will be our first one as part of the Urban History Month, but we're hoping to continue to host these conversations as we go on throughout this upcoming year as we get ready for urban history next year. The idea of what we're doing, once again, is to just provide support, provide, how shall I say it, not just support, but information, guidance, you know, assistance to early career scholars, giving folks an opportunity to think of new ways that we can not just use urban history, but use it to propel ourselves forward, use it to bring our knowledge to the forefront, use it to include more people in these types of conversations. So thank you to the panelists. If you all are interested in what we've been doing, please join us again on October 30th. And we have our panel discussion of Beyond the Professorate as we start thinking of ways that early career scholars can leverage their education into careers that are beyond the professorate. My name is Anthony Pratcher. On behalf of my co-chair, Daniela Sheenan, thank you all so much. Thank you to Destin, Becky, Gabe for sharing your great work with us, sharing your time with us today. And thank you to the audience for coming and participating, bringing the questions that you have, and just enjoying and appreciating the scholars that we have with us. So thank you, everyone. I
Thanks,
hope that you all have
Anthony.
a well
Thanks,
and
everyone.
blessed day. Peace,
Thank
peace,
you.
peace.
Thank
Peace.
you. Thanks, everybody.